Thank you very much for having me. I mean, a couple hundred person hours of attention is a responsibility, so I hope you find this interesting. I've been interested in consciousness since, I mean, my entire life, as I'm sure many people here. In college, I briefly got demoralized that it was impossible, and then maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I had some insights that made me think that there were things that we could genuinely learn. But I've actually never published a paper on my thoughts on consciousness. I've actually never given a public talk on my thoughts on consciousness. So here I'm gonna go through, and hopefully about 30 minutes. So there's a lot to get through. Several different interrelated ideas that I've kind of come across over the last 5 or 7 years of thinking about this that you might find interesting. So first of all, what do we mean by consciousness? Because one of the issues with this field is that when there's 100 different definitions and people mean very different things. And so I think you have to ground this to have a really concrete discussion. And I'm going to use an operational definition of consciousness here, which is consciousness is the thing that is modulated by anesthetics or psychedelics. And especially psychedelics, because anesthetics have a confound of the amnesia. And so without necessarily endorsing psychedelics, they're a pharmacological agent that can reliably and repeatedly perturb this thing that we kind of all recognize as consciousness, and it's clearly related to underlying biochemistry. And so I think even though the insights on psychedelics are unreliable, the lesson that I took from learning about them is that there's a real thing that can be explained with science that you can affect with chemistry. And I think that gives it a really grounded, even when you're talking about this like phenomenal content concepts, we know that there must be some connection back to biology and physics that we can do things about. So I don't know that I need to motivate this to necessarily this audience, but just to recap like why I think it is important, because again, when you're talking about consciousness, you might be talking about many different things. So what makes turning off an LLM different than turning off a person? There's a good argument that consciousness is the source of value in the universe, and especially valence-bearing experience. You can discuss whether non-valently loaded experience has the same moral value, but in some sense, this is like the source of value in the universe, and so it's imperative to really understand it. And then from an engineering and practical perspective, if we could develop a physical theory that allowed us to build the technologies for this idea called substrate independence, if you tried to understand what was going on in the brain and recreate that in a machine, that would be a totally transformative for the human condition. You'd have entities that didn't age, that didn't get sick, that could be transferred at almost the speed of light. So the question is like, is this practical? Some assumptions. And so in one form of this talk, the first slide was like titled an apology, because I think one of the issues with consciousness, I mean, there's few fields like this that really reinforce to you there's no such thing as new ideas. Like they've all been had before. But this is really my worldview of how the things that I see out there, how they fit together. And so there's some background that's needed to contextualize that. The first is that I think we're looking for something that is fundamental, or at least as fundamental as mass and charge. We're looking for a primary property of the universe that you've got very deep physical explanations for. And we're looking for things that have very fundamental feeling objects. The second is that I think it's related to computation, transformation of information. I think that the bit is a unit that shows up a lot in my thinking about consciousness. People can debate, take exception to this idea of like, is the universe a computer? I'd say like, we might call it something different, but it's this idea that there's these states that interact that can solve problems when you configure your matter system carefully, you get the sense that it's doing these computations. It, at least for us, is emergent from the brain, which critically is composed only of ordinary matter arranged according to the rules of chemistry. So this goes back to like my operational definition of grounding here. So you can look at like, is consciousness impossible? Is there some fundamental barrier to understanding it? Like, to think that there's something that couldn't be understood, even though we can affect it pharmacologically, you'd have to say that there's something that is special about the particular proteins and the lipid bilayers and the way that the biology works that I think is probably not that fundamental. I don't think it's that integrated necessarily in the IIT sense. Like, I can easily decouple my hearing from my vision by putting on headphones. I never confuse things that I see with things that I hear. You can always form a product space of multiple aspects of this, but I don't think that it's integrated in more than like a trivial sense. And critically, it's orthogonal to intelligence. I think it is possible to have a pure experience in the absence of intelligence, and it is orthogonal to agency. So I think sometimes when people talk about, especially in the context of machine intelligence, they talk about sentience. I think that's wrapped up in elements of like, can it impact the world? And that isn't, I think we're really going for like pure quails. here. That is the thing that we want to understand. So obviously these aren't assumptions, like you would like these to fall out of a theory, but I think it's so slippery you have to pick something to start from. And then before we get to the kind of more interesting part of the talk, I operationalize this through a handful of questions that have kind of hit me over the years that I've spent a lot of time trying to find answers to, which again, like nothing here is new. All of these questions have been asked before, but so the brain is encased in this dark vault of a skull. It's not magically connected to the environment. And so the brain, which contains the world model that we experience, and there's great neural correlates of that, it is only connected to the environment through a small number of fiber bundles. And how does it know if it's only getting spikes? How does it know that some spikes should be seen and some spikes should be heard? Because from the perspective of the brain, they're just spikes. For that matter, why do I have the kind of aspects or modes that I do? Like, why do I have vision and hearing and monologue and not like other things? I think this is something that we want an explanation to. A little separate, there's what determines how quickly time passes phenomenally to us, like what determines the length of the moment. And there's things that can make it longer or shorter. This has been studied extensively in animals, but like why is our moment the length that it is? Another thing that might sound a little more abstract, but I think we want an answer to, and I think we can get one, is why do I experience like my vision, my hearing, and not my vision of your hearing, if it's all just computation of the universe? And then finally, like the very classic question, which at the very end, we'll see if you think that there's any insight that's been shed, is like, is my red the same as your red? And critically, we're looking for an explanation that doesn't inherently depend on things like neurons or spikes. So like I mentioned, the brain is kind of secreted away in the skull, and everything it gets are down these cables. So vision is conveyed into the brain by cranial nerve 2, which conveys the retina topically mapped information. Acoustic information is carried into the thalamus from nerve 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. And so somehow, and it's like these dots kind of all you think have to kind of look the same to the brain somehow. So what is going on here? So this isn't from a mouse. These are retinal waves. So this is before the eyes even open. There's the spontaneous. So if you take a mouse retina and you culture it, you kind of put it in an MEA. There's this spontaneous activity that it gets even before the eyes open. And so what this is doing is it's teaching the brain about retinotopy. Cells that are coactive are more likely to be close to each other. There are some waves that are never in phase, which teaches your brain that you've got two eyes. And this type of spontaneous activity that captures the structure of vision alone is enough to get a lot of the tuning that you see in visual cortex. And we know that there's nothing special genetically about visual cortex that's doing this, because back in, I think 2000, there was an experiment that was done where the experimenters took the optic nerve from the branch off the superior colliculus into the thalamus and rerouted that to auditory cortex. And they saw visual like tuning appear in A1. So there's the sense that cortex is kind of this very flexible program that can figure out how to make sense of the input that it's getting from the intrinsic structure. And so here, this is when you can see a normal A1 in the center in the middle, a normal V1 in terms of the representation. This is medial and anterior for different cells responding to things. And the tuning that you see in the ferret here, the rewired ferret, looks a lot like the tuning that you see in a V1 and not a lot like the tuning that you see in A1. And this information makes it through to behavior. So you can do an experiment where you have a mouse or a ferret in a box where it can get a visual stimuli from either the left or right visual hemifield or from a speaker, and or from the center. And so the blue is before that this rerouting happened, or before this superior colliculus was lesioned in that hemifield. And you can see that it can do it fine, but then when you lesion it, it becomes unresponsive. Like it guesses at chance, which is 50%, for visual stimuli presented in the right hemifield. However, so the green bar are the rewired ferrets, which really recover the ability to do this. And so there's taking this visual stimuli and being able to respond to this in behavior. That was a pretty complicated intervention that affected a lot of stuff in the brain. And so I think it's useful to look at a simpler system. So there's this brittle sea star, which on the ends of its arms, it has these chromatophores that are light sensitive proteins. And there's two species of sea star, Wenti and Pumila, that have the same number of chromatophores, and they're both arranged in a circle. But Wenti is defined by these melanin capsules. that have the effect of sheltering it from light coming from some directions. And so at the bottom, you can see kind of the responsivity of this extraocular lens at the end of the arm. And so for the last two, so the middle one is pumila, which doesn't have the melon capsules. And you can see that it is equally responsive to light coming from any direction. Similarly, when T that is dark adapted, so it's only been raised in darkness, it is also responsive to light coming from all directions. But in the regular when T, there's a symmetry that is broken here, and it now has some spatial source localization information that allows it to orient to visual stimuli. So one way we can say this is that pumila's photodetection system is source angle invariant up to a rotation, which is a symmetry that is observed by this neural processing system. And this is a symmetry that is broken in its cousin. Now, the unbroken one here, it's, and so critically, this is the same number of chromatophores. So it's not like there's more information. I think when people think of vision, they think that vision is a very high bandwidth sense. Here, it's exactly the same amount of information, but the difference is how it is structured. And that has, I think, a profound impact on how it shows up to the brain. Now, the unbroken one here, so this is just a scalar intensity. There's no source information. As you can see, you can rotate it and you get the same thing. And so scalar intensities we usually think of as acoustic signals. And so there's no source, so if you think about audio, at least monaural audio, there's no source localization unless your brain and ear anatomy is doing more stuff. And absolute time translation conveys no meaning. Now you can extract more than just an intensity because typically these get Fourier transformed and then the organisms deal with the spectrogram. But for any organism, there's a maximum theoretically detectable frequency determined by primarily the transduction kinetics, like how fast can these things respond, the chromatophores or other sensing organs. And then there's a minimum detectable frequency, which I'll come back to later, which is, I think, really determined by the flicker fusion threshold, which is related to the length of the moment, which is a thing I'll touch on. Now, if we have smart brains, you can get more out of an acoustic signal. You don't have to see it as just like a gray square. And so our brains are capable of doing very sophisticated source separation. So even though this is a Fourier transform, but it was originally just a list of scalar number of like intensities, and we can extract objects from that, things like drums and vocals and guitars. But this is not present in the structure of the signal. It's present in the manifold in the brain that is extracting it. And so if you've got a different neural representation, you might extract different things from this signal. So this is the ears of two bats. So it's a transfer function of kind of how it, the impulse response of the ear complex of a type of bat. And on the right side, they've kind of removed or impaired a part of the ear called the pinna. And so you can see, so the three frames here are for sounds at different elevation on some side of the bat or the other. And by just changing the conformation of the ear, you can see in the first column, this transfer function changes substantially. And so this allows it to generate source localization information in actually a fairly rich way from this monaural signal because of the structure of the ear. And when the ear is not responsive into this active listening process, you can see that second column, it looks a lot more similar across each of these things. So the bat has to actually take active action to engage with its sense of hearing in order to get this spatial attribution. And bats, of course, can use audio signals for all kinds of stuff. They can even get, there's evidence that they can even get things like object texture based on the echoes that they're getting. And if you look in their brains, in the hippocampus and the thalamus, here there's there's the setup here is there's a bat on a perch and there's a target that it's tracking that it wants to eat. And as the target gets closer, you can decode, so kind of these bottom two plots, or kind of really any of these plots, are about there are cells in the bat's brain that represent the target location and tracks it spatially. And there are even cells in the bat's brain that tracks the target not just egocentrically, but allocentrically, reference to the absolute, to an environment around itself. And this is actually a lot of cells in the bat brain. And so it's using an auditory stimulus in the sense that it's an acoustic wave transmitted over air, but this is profoundly not time or pitch translation invariant. It is, I think, a really good argument that it is seeing these things because of the representations that are being created in the brain from its transduction organs are allowing it to extract visual type symmetries from the information. And so the kind of the main moral here is that representations can be learned from unreinforced experience. If you have a mouse, so a couple different mice in a task, some of them you reinforce and some of them you don't. The top row is so it's the top row is a mouse that got reinforcement. Bottom row is non-reinforced. First column is before like at the beginning, and the second column is after a while in the environment. And you can see that even without reinforcement, like it doesn't need grounding to reward in order to use this information. It can learn the structure of the channel purely from the internal structure of the signal. And so the first big idea, like the conjecture here, is that the brain acts as this structural prism, splitting information into modes based on shared symmetries that you can write down like a visual group or an auditory group or a somatosensory group. And when you fit these representations, they don't have shared embeddings. And so the brain has to split them because you can't experience them together. And so that is the basic operation of cortex from a phenomenal perspective. Let's see. And importantly, this is about the structure of the world model, not necessarily sensory streams. So this works even in the absence of information coming in through the eyes or like new stimulus from the world, because the world model is always running there in the brain. And that's the thing that we experience. And obviously, like the image that falls on the retina is highly occluded and has all kinds of gaps in it, and it all gets filled in by the brain. And so we're really talking about the world model, the structure of the world model that is learned from this data. And so this idea, so Kanai and co have developed into a nice mathematical formulation that captures a lot of the core idea here, where so if you want to learn these set of symmetries, you the thing that we want to get out is like the object is like, for example, a dog is a dog no matter where it is in your visual field. So even though the stimulus might be different, and a lot of the intermediate representation processing might be different, at the end, you get this object class out that is conserved. And so we'd say that this channel is invariant with respect to that. And there's this really nice formalism involving a principal fiber bundle that allows you to get two classes of object here. One is kind of the structure of the quail itself, which they refer to as an attribute, which is invariant. That's always going to be the same between people. And then, but the signature, which is like the neural representation or other thing that is driving it, might be different. And so you have this plastic mapping between kind of the phenomenal object that we think is invariant and the physical implementation. And so you can learn a mode, which is identified by a group, a set of symmetries. And for the different types of objects, you have different types of symmetries. So for a visual object like a dog or a cat, I mean, those are not like going from a dog to a cat is not the same object. That would be a move through the phenomenal space. But any translation of a dog or translation of a cat is the same dog or cat. Similarly, colors are invariant up to a rotation, or pitches, like audio pitches, are invariant up to a rotation. And so this is a really nice formalism that I'll use later. So to touch on like what is a representation, because like not everybody does neuroscience and maybe there's other things that you bring to this, I just kind of want to motivate this core idea because it's the thing I'm going to keep talking about. So if you stick, so this is from Doris Zhao's group at Berkeley, but if you stick an electrode in the brain of a monkey, and then you show it many different types of stimuli, here you can see there's like these big stripes in the first column. And so if you look at the x-axis, that's like when it showed it faces as opposed to bodies or fruits or hands, these cells really lit up. So you can say that in some sense, these cells are selective for faces. And from recording those cells, you can fit a manifold that has, as you move around that, you move through the space of faces. And you can actually use a model to convert this between spikes and the space of faces. And it turns out that in the case of faces in macaques, you only need about 200 neurons to totally recover a really nice generative model of the space of faces. And so when I talk about a representation, I'm really talking about this like map of object space here. And so there's, building on this idea, there's three kind of ideas that are important. The first is the object. So this is the underlying concept. This is an abstract thing that has no physical existence. And then you can learn a representation, for example, of an object space, which we've got. You can do this in a number of ways. We fit them in deep learning. You can find them in the brain. But to actually use a representation in reality, like in the physical world, you need another concept, which is this idea that I'm calling a trace, which is the instantiation of a representation as a physical system. And so that's mapping from this abstract, like the representation here is just a set of matrix multiplications. You can store that on a computer. But the trace in the brain is like the neural firing activity. I'm using the term trace to mean it is like the physical record of you had to pump an ion around, or you had to make some irreversible effect that consumed energy, and that left a trace in the universe. And so when you look at these things, like if we look at to the face area in monkeys, or it's inferotemporal cortex in monkeys, these neurons are polysemantic, so they are activated by multiple things to greater or lesser degrees, even if they have some selectivity. But they're also not perfectly anatomically defined. And so I think a very important question here is, how do you draw a border around a trace, which is to say, how do you draw a border around a representation in a physical system? So it is very important to realize that in the real world, like there are many ways to create a bit. You like the memory in your computer, electrons in a trap. Like if you leave a coin heads up or down on a table, if you leave a window open or closed, any quantum number can accept a bit theoretically. But to do this in the real world, you have to spend energy to do it. And there's a minimum floor, which is Landauer's limit, which in practice we never get anywhere close to. And at room temperature is about 0.018 electron volts. And in practice, the way that we physically implement these things are much more energy intensive. But the core idea is that every logical bit has a physical existence as matter, which takes energy to create. So traces are these like physical memories. You don't necessarily think of the dynamical activity of a neuron as a memory, but it leaves this indelible mark on the universe that then something else will respond to, or it'll affect some other state. And you can often go back and recreate what happened. And so there's relatively simple, this is from Rovelli, Carlo Rovelli, who's a physicist who I think is great. And the conditions to produce traces in the universe are actually relatively simple. You just need some way of, you need some thermodynamic insulation between some parts of it, so you get some sense of system separation. You need a past low entropy state, because otherwise it's not possible to store things. And you need there to be some temperature gap that resists thermalization for some period of time. So that you can think of the temperature of the memory, that starts lower than, or different than the environment. And then over the course of this time constant Tm, the time constant of the memory, there's a set of amount of energy that is transferred from the environment to the trace, that eventually on the characteristic time scale of tau m here, tau for memory, it transfers some amount of entropy between the environment and the system, and you lose the ability to distinguish that system. You can think of like the 1-bit case here as like the minimum example here is you've got a particle in an energy well, and it's like, what is the time constant of it ending up on the other side of this as a function of the temperature difference between the system that's storing that particle and the bath around it. And so you can have things that have very different time constants, like the footprints on the moon are going to last a long time, much longer than a pile of rocks like in a river. But both of these, neither of these are feedback controlled. Both of these will get eroded, because these are just passive structures that have there's no like nothing maintaining it in this state, even though in some cases it looks like the state might persist a long time. To sample, so if you have a representation and you want to generate you want to take the latency, you want to generate an object. So first of all, these objects are objects of pure information. There's a certain amount of entropy that has to be reduced in order to generate that information. You have to pay an energy cost for that to generate this trace. And doing this takes energy, and that's not just, I mean, this is above and beyond actually the energy of the substrate itself. Now, we do see things that persist for long periods of time, and these typically tend to be things that are stabilized through feedback control. So this question of like, how do we avoid getting thermalized in some period of time? We can actively maintain the state of that system. And so you can start from that. So this is the equation from 2 slides ago, where over some characteristic time based on the difference in temperature between the systems, you lose some entropy. At the beginning, we can kind of define this to be equivalent to the entropy of the representation that we're sampling. And then at each operation of a feedback cycle, you take some actions from so this would be k steps per cycle. You take some action from some repertoire of control actions, and that offsets this loss of entropy. So we're generating information in order to feed it back into the system. And that requires, so that you do some rearrangement, you get this thing. So at each loop of the feedback controller, you get some loss of variational free energy, which is related to kind of how fit to the world, like how accurately have you preserved the trace. And proportionally, this increases the entropy in the controller system per cycle, which implies an energy transfer from the controller to the trace, which then does work on the surrounding environment. And so there's this really like fundamental connection here between the like energy and feedback controllers and the ability to stabilize information in the universe and not just have it be kind of like you make a mark on a book and then that will get whatever happens to that. And so we can call these feedback stabilized traces forms. That's just my vocabulary for it. So feedback control, especially in the brain, can impose constraints on the state updates depending on how the feedback controller is implemented. And so specifically, going back to this first idea of the modes are distinguished by separate groups. Like you can imagine like a visual group or an auditory group, and this determines the types of phenomenal content that you'd expect to be associated with it. And so in your feedback controller, at each loop of this, you can impose the constraints of a group on the system to maintain it. And so even though we're not preserving just like a footprint or like a static object, there's dynamics that are happening and it's moving. There's a dynamical system which is visiting different points. As it does that, we're constraining it to a manifold. And in the brain, I mean, there are outputs to behavior and the projections out to muscles. But here, I mean, if we're interested in consciousness, we're also interested in this new representational state that gets fed back and acted upon separately from the invariant preserving feedback mechanism. And so this might predict things like modules in the brain, like we talk about the brain being recurrent, but we might predict that there's kind of separable submodules that do this, that are associated with a mode, and are not necessarily strongly coupled to other parts of the brain. And of course, the brain is absolutely full of loops. I think like the conventional was there like 20 years ago, there's people talk about like cortical thalamic striatal loops, or other things. And I think like there's a much richer picture of this now. And every one of these paths can impose a different set of symmetries to generate its different manifold, and thereby kind of enriching the structure that is extractable by the brain and what it's doing with it. And there are loops even in the absence of goal-directed activity, like this is the default mode network, that are just kind of on when your eyes are closed and you're resting, and they're still running these invariant preserving loops in the brain, kind of all over the place. So information is inherently perspectival. In order to measure anything, you need to choose a source of a basis with respect to that the measurement is made. So like if you're observing a particle in motion, you get to choose your coordinate system that gives a concrete meaning to the numerical like measurements that you're gonna get out of this thing. You can actually make the numbers whatever you want by choosing a different basis. Now in the like in the real world, generally for Hermitian observable, so like how does the brain know what basis to use? Like a pressurized tank of gas might have very high entropy, but unless you're looking at it with a specially crafted basis, it's going to be hard to see information in it. Or things like encryption, you can think of this as observing a plain text relative to a key or a ciphertext relative to a key. These are all just different measurement bases for the observation. And so generally for Hermitian observable, we want to use its orthonormal eigenbasis, but there's nothing that requires us to do so. And of course, the brain doesn't like have that ahead of time. So it's doing something autonomously based on local learning rules. And it produces these things called disentangled representations. And so a disentangled representation is a decomposition of a symmetry group that it gives you independent subspaces where kind of they're all, the action of anyone leaves the others unaffected. And this, so if you fit a neural network, so this is just a variational autoencoder, to an informational bottleneck in the center for those latent units, we recover these disentangled representations where it separates these things out into these maximally orthogonal high dimensional representations. And if you look in the brain, you see this fairly well predicts the type of tuning that you see in many areas of the brain. And so the brain is somehow kind of on its own learning these disentangled representations that allow it to kind of get this measurement basis to make these observations meaningful. Now, even though the brain is highly recurrent, and we're talking about loops even beyond that, these can in general be linearized. And specifically in the context of a feedback controller, where there's some definite set of computations that have a beginning and an end. And you can do things like, so you can inject new observations by conditioning the space along the way. But, and this is more speculative, I haven't done this yet, but I suspect that for areas of recurrence, a renormalization type technique would probably allow you to get a smoothed representation. And so loops implement computation with a beginning and an end. And if you just look at the single cell, you can see you can think of the receptive field of a neuron as this Euclidean space, or in general terms, a Hilbert space. And it has some preferred some activation of input coming into that cell that when you take like a cosine product, if it is maximally aligned with its this learned vector, it'll be more likely to fire. And so this gives you the sense that the representation that is actually being acted on in a cell is bounded above by the product space of all of the prior Hilbert groups in the earlier units that synapse onto it. And so this gives you the sense that you can, for the total loop, you can get this, in the last unit, you have this massive Hilbert space that you've accumulated. And you don't see this if you look at just the spiking activity, but I think the interpretation of the spiking activity is what is the axis of variation that is extracted at that unit? And then the whole structure is passed along implicitly to the downstream cells based on the invariants that are being enforced. And so this suggests an answer to on-manifold feature binding. So there's several different binding problems. One is, why do you see like red and cup and like with a texture and not have separate experiences of those, which is different than like, why do you have vision or hearing? But here I think that there's a possible answer, which is they're all like the dynamical activity of these cells is they're accumulating these spaces that are being passed down along the structure. And so one of the core ideas here is going back to, if you've got a representation or you've got a trace, how do you draw a border around that? And I think that, and other people have had this idea too, but understanding how to draw a border around a form is equivalent to understanding the binding problem. Like what groups those physical activations together to the exclusion of other things. And so the central question is like, what bounds these things? And I think that it's bounded by the feedback controller that is burning energy to stabilize it. This is, so this is not necessarily new, but it gives you these very nice interpretations of things like causal closure and system separation, and the ability to generate information in these mixed systems. So changing direction for a second, separate question, how long is the present? So I have another kind of concept that I think about sometimes, which is the moment. And a moment is a block of observation within which we cannot temporarily order its parts. So even though this image is unchanging and it does not have a temporal extent, it does have an integration time, which is the amount of observation that it averaged over in the image. And that prevents us from doing things like knowing, are the candles entering or are they leaving? In some cases, like if you throw a ball and take a picture, you'll have a strong sense that it's going one direction, but that could be faked if you have like elaborate lighting or like strobes and things, so that it's actually, you can't get guarantees about it. And so to introduce two variables here, we can think of the time that passes at like 1 second per second, or is measurable in like cesium decays, as proper time. This is what physics, it's very standard physics idea. And then we can call like 1 moment per proper time as the ego time. And I'm going to call this an integration volume for reasons that'll become, I think, more clear in a second. But this is, I think, a really basic idea, but it has some kind of interesting non-obvious consequences, which is for a given length of a moment or integration volume, there's a maximum wavelength of light that can be mapped onto a perceived color. So imagine if your moment is very short and you've got like a kilometer wave and you've got like a radio antenna, like you literally can't absorb it in the time that the moment exists. And so it like literally does not fit in the moment. And so this predicts things like flicker fusion, which is a transition between when you go from seeing like a flashing light to seeing a solid light, or from hearing beats to hearing a tone. And we can define this for every mode. So for sound, there's a longest wavelength of sound that can be mapped onto a phenomenal pitch, which is defined in terms of tau echo and the speed of sound in air. And so this, I mean, this kind of implies this idea of a phenomenal Nyquist rate. And as that increases, meaning the moment gets shorter, we gain temporal resolving power, which might have evolutionary advantages. Like you might want to be like cats can beat snakes because they see faster. But it means that your moment gets less rich because there's a limit to how much, there's things that you won't be able to represent in a moment if it's very short. And so there's, I think, a fundamental tension there for some, like if you have a moment that's longer, you can have much richer informational structures. And if you have it that's short, then you'll be able to respond faster. And critically, this doesn't imply like the gain or loss of colors or tones, because the experience of a quail like red or 10 kilohertz, you experience that in constant phenomenal time. And so that comes down to the structure of the mode and the shape of the manifold. But so you could expect that to get remapped, but it still has very practical impacts for the types of things that you can perceive. So for percepts that happen very close together, they get mandatorily integrated. And so there's some well-known illusions that you can do where if you've got, say, you've got two balls that are they're just square waves, they don't actually overlap in any way. As they're rolling around, you see them as two different dots going in the right direction. But if you had a third one and now they overlap within this thing that I'm calling a moment, you actually get this paradoxical percept. And if you correlate this, in this case, to the alpha rhythm, which is this big synchronizing oscillation that starts primarily in thalamus, but has a bunch of sources, propagates up through cortex and back down. So if you present a stimuli within within the bounds of one of these oscillations, they get mandatorily integrated. And if they're the same time apart, but they're on the other side of the peak, you get two percepts. And so there's a bunch of different big oscillations in the brain. The alpha rhythm is in the 4 to 12 hertz range. And that is typically the one that ends up in memory and has most verbal report. And there's the faster ones, especially the gamma oscillation, which is at the 30 to 60 hertz range. And so I think that one interpretation of these is that the gamma oscillation is doing higher speed local integration, which determines the structure of your modes. And the alpha oscillation is determining basically the length of your moment. So it's integrating these different modes together, binding those together into a moment where you get your hearing and your vision and your somatic sensation together. So there's whether the modes are integrated or in superposition actually has a bunch of impacts. So if you're familiar with IIT, IIT is all integration. Like there's none of these things are separable. In fact, the central measure is about how they're not separable. But I'm not convinced that these things are actually integrated for reasons that I mentioned earlier. Particular disentangling, where these subspaces don't act on each other, implies mode independence. And then when you look at the formalism developed by Ryota, the compositionality in the fiber bundle implies that these things are in superposition. And as a little bit of evidence kind of in support of this view, I just point out that the flicker fusion thresholds, the flicker fusion constants are quite different by mode, which I think means that these are in some sense getting processed separately and then getting bound together into a moment. So measuring anything takes some minimum amount of space or time or space time. So if you take like a Fourier transform of this signal and you do it over a longer time window, you'll get an accurate spectrogram of the signal that you're recording. And if you have a shorter window relative to the periodicity of the signal, then you'll get it'll degrade in various ways, and you'll get things like high passing. But the limit of this is if you just try to FFT a single point, like you can't FFT a single point. There's no frequency constant of a single point. It's a number. And there's a bunch of things to realize here. Like there's like one photon hitting the retina is not enough to associate a color with it, because that gives you an intensity over distribution, and you actually need to accumulate a bunch of different photons from that point in space in order to assign them accurately to a color. Related to this, there's no such thing as a white photon. Like the color white is a loss of spatiotemporal resolving power. If your eye was infinitely fast, you'd always see just a flicker of colors. You'd never see the color white. And you might think that there's ways to cheat this, like instead of having absorbing light over time in order to assign a color, maybe we have a bunch of materials with engineered work functions that are responsive to different wavelengths, and then you can have a spatially distributed measurement. But that is actually not a free lunch, and you can end up with, like, you can use space or time, but there's a trade-off there, and it's not necessarily better. And so the intuition here is that extracting information from physical variables requires a sufficient volume of space-time for the measurement being taken. And then the extension to consciousness here is that I think phenomenal states can only reflect information that exists and can be measured. And so this, again, ties back to this idea of a phenomenal moment as being this real thing that has a spatiotemporal extent that is related to your ability to observe. And so like a thought experiment to check the intuitions here is imagine if you had a brain that was so large that it had meaningful internal light delay. Well, if we think that this feedback controller action is important and that's operating classically, then tau echo must be at least as long as the maximum delay for the signal to propagate through the circuit. And so therefore, and if you believe that the moments are packed back to back with no gaps, then and again, there's constant phenomenal time to perceive any of these percepts. Like it doesn't, your experience of the moment doesn't take longer. Like you can still see red or green in constant time in terms of the qualia experience, the phenomenal content. But as tau echo increases, this leads to an increase in the apparent rate of passage of time. If your moment was faster, then each one would take more proper time. And so then, and that's like your atomic unit of observation. And so this would seem like time was going faster relative to other things for you. Okay, so the brain is this highly distributed neural processing system. Like where in here is the consciousness? Is there like some set of cells, like when it hits there, it's reflected? Is there some special sub part of the brain? So going back to like understanding how to draw borders around this is equivalent to understanding the binding problem. My suspicion is that forms are bounded by the controller, which burns energy to stabilize them. And anytime you do this, you generate qualia. And so there's like, I think like this is interpretation where the universe is highly conscious, maybe not valently loaded, and certainly doesn't have a sense of self-identity or ego representation, which is an explicit representation that has to be constructed by the brain and is not for free in the phenomenal content. And this predicts islands. And the length of the moment corresponds to the time constant of that feedback controller. So like the length of the moment here, if we've got a correlation to the alpha rhythm, that corresponds to the length of the moment, and then that kind of determines the richness of the instantaneous experience. Okay, so one of the other questions in the explicablandum from the beginning, why do I see my vision and hearing and not say split with other people? So it's not, I think when people talk about causal power, one of the issues I have with this is that all communication is about creating correlations between brains. Like every time I say a word, this depends on having a pre-shared concept space that then you can like receive the cursor vector and use this to light up a concept space that you already had to create these correlations across our brains. And that is causal power. And if we don't have suitable pre-shared concept spaces, like we don't have any shared languages, or there's a bunch of math or other exposure that you don't have, then there'll be a lossy embedding to try to translate these things, and it might be impossible. And so, but the thing that does separate our brains is the fact that they're under independent feedback controllers with independent thermalization times. And even though we can send information, we don't send energy. And so the fact that these are physically decoupled from the feedback control system, I think gives you this way to nucleate independent, individuated moments. Now, if you could find a way to transmit that, to integrate the feedback controllers over the network, this implies some really cool stuff, which I will kind of mention at the beginning. Now, I think some people see this and they're like, okay, but like, are you saying trees are conscious, or is like the Chinese room conscious? And like, maybe, certainly not like we are. I do think that the universe cares how these are physically implemented. And it's not, I don't believe in computational equivalent in just pure computationalism. How you actually implement these things physically does matter. But just because that feels strange, I don't think is a reason to dismiss it. For example, in quantum mechanics, there's these misconceptions that quantum mechanics is about things that are small or fast or cold, when in reality, it's about information isolation. And if you had a sophisticated apparatus, you could actually place like a whole planet into superposition. Like the math of quantum mechanics works just fine. And in practice, you don't really see these systems, so you don't like worry about them that much. But it has this, but other parts of physics have this universal applicability, and we are used to dealing with that. And so I think that just the feeling of unease is probably not reliable here. Okay, so I know that I've been going for longer than 30 minutes. I'm getting towards the end. Just one more key idea after this one. So things that I don't have a solid sense of, like whatever my thought um, is like, where does valence come from? That's not a thing that I was touched on in here. I think is a little bit still mysterious to me. Neurobiologically, how is the central feedback controller actually implemented in the brain? Is there a pacemaker that's sitting all these other circuits? Are there metabolic costs that are detectable? And this third one, I think, is the thing that like upsets most people, because if you ask this room, like, is a destructively scanned upload you? Like if you were dying of cancer and we just like scanned you into a computer and then started you up the next day on a computer, I bet half of the room would be like, yeah, sign me up. That's great. And the other half would be like, that's just a different person. What are you talking about? And in my experience, having this conversation many, many times, I think that there's a choice of metaphysics that everybody's brains make, which is metastable, but very stable within that, from which you reason. And that is a thing that is not bridged by language. And so if you think about like Parfit's continuing relation, you could, if you really want to, choose to see either of those as valid, even though I think that continuity of identity, like the thing that makes you going on, is the phenomenal continuity, not even that it replicates your agency or your speech patterns. Okay, so one last idea, and then I will be done. This is so up till now, I think that the things that I've talked about are probably going to end up in the literature over the next decade, that there's interesting stuff there one way or the other. This is much more speculative, but it's one of those things where there's like a set of logical steps that when I look at them, I'm like, where's the problem? And so I want to lay it out. So we've got this dynamical system of the neural activity, extrinsic dimension, number of neurons, intrinsic dimension, whatever your manifolds are fit by the brain. And we can use the free energy principle to get a measure of variational free energy over that, which gives us a Lagrangian for the dynamical system of the brain. And going back to the principal bundle structure of qualia, we have a fiber bundle, which defines a set of symmetries that are enforced by this system. And so I don't know about you, but to me, that looks like all of the machinery required for a classical field theory. And I can see people already saying, like, just because you like could doesn't mean you should. But before I get there, a quick comment, because I said we want an explanation that is not in terms of just neurons, but fear not, there's an empirical finding from deep learning and neuroscience that these different models trained on different data sets with different objectives are converging to very common representations. And so there's the sense that these models in the brain are grabbing onto the same underlying true data manifold. And there's actually fairly strong versions of this now, where it turns out that basically all embeddings of different models of the same structural type are equivalent. And this works well enough that there's like practical security implications. Like if you have an embedding database, which is just like a big list of numbers. So like, I don't know if you're familiar with like retrieval augmented generation, which is very popular in AI now, where you take a bunch of data, you embed it in some projective space, and then you can do similarity score over that to find things that are similar. But if you just have a list of embeddings and you know no other information, you can actually convert those back to samples, because these embeddings are all basically interchangeable. And so even though we were talking about this dynamical space of neurons, I think that the representations that are being learned are highly convergent and are basically these Platonic forms. So in this explanation, there's nothing specific about the brain. And so the question here is, you take this field theory, what happens if you stuff it through canonical quantization? What do you got? And I haven't done that yet. That's a whole project. But I think that there's some properties of that resulting field that you can comment on. So it's non-Poincare invariant, so different observers can see different things. And like, the question is, like, if you stuff this thing through canonical quantization, do you get a non-Poincare invariant gauge field whose excitation we could plausibly call a quale? There's so when you do this, this field is equipped with a local symmetry, a gauge symmetry. And I think this ties back to that fiber structure, which is the local symmetry that you get is a freedom to relabel qualia. And so any consistent relabeling is basically, so like this, the question is like, is your red my red? And my answer is like, yes, up to a gauge transform. Um, so we can observe that the symmetries that we're actually using in this, like the fiber bundle that we're using, is specific to a type of brain. And so things like just like the existence of RGB images assumes things like image forming lenses and 3D color spaces. And so in general, the symmetries that we're applying are brain dependent. And so that doesn't feel so fundamental. And so I think that the next leap, the last element of this idea, is that what you actually do when you do this, the field that you get out is not about qualia, but the fundamental configuration is actually about is the fiber space itself. So the symmetry group of all possible modes. And that then when a particular brain couples to this, there's a spontaneous symmetry breaking where you go from having a bit to having a quale. And yeah, so the final question is like, what if this thing is real? Certainly you can do this math. Like there's nothing wrong with the math here. Like you could do all this math. But if it's just this like complex mathematical exercise, like who cares? Like that might just be a huge distraction. But the real question in my mind is like, if you did that, are there non-trivial implications that you could actually be able to test? And so this is compatible with property dualism, or there's still only one type of stuff. Like we're still just talking about matter. But you've got like emergent physical properties and the mental properties are both ontologically real. And this would allow us to say that consciousness is ontologically real. And if we're saying that we can affect consciousness with like chemical agents, that seems like a thing we want to be able to say. Um, and um, so one way to think about testing this is that even though the representations in the individual brains might be very different, the fiber space itself should be conserved in any possible conscious system. And a signature of that might be detectable. So we are used to thinking about how neural activity produces subjective experience, but if there is like an ontologically real thing here, then that might imply the possibility of downward causation. And you can do this in an energy conservative way where you're just transmitting information. You're basically rearranging the energy that's already available to it to impose information. And it's one of the problems with studying consciousness is that without introducing new physics, there's no way to evaluate it behaviorally. I think the only way to be confident in a theory is to see it for yourself, maybe with a big BCI or with a drug or with some other perturbation to your own experience. But this creates the possibility of detectable signatures that would point you at like actually genuinely new physics. And so to be very like, I have no evidence that this is actually happening, but I think that the logical path is like fairly straightforward. And I find it fairly exciting to think that there's the possibility of like genuinely new physics at work here. I don't know if you're familiar with Kristen and Tatiana Hogan. They're very unique twins in Canada who are joined at a big fiber bundle connecting their thalami. So they don't have a lot of connectivity of their cortices, but they are connected to the thalamus and they can see through each other's eyes. They can feel somatosensory stimuli. They have actually an internal communication channel, most likely. And so one question you might ask is like when one of them is having the experience of pain from another, which is especially interesting because that happens before you get to the thalamus, or say vision. If you were to characterize the information processing crossing the fiber bundle in the absence of behavior, do you actually see the full visual representations being sent, or do you just see like a low entropy binding signal? And in lieu of a unique situation like this, you could also ask the same question about the corpus callosum, about why do we see a unified visual field and not two hemifields? And what are the minimum requirements to get that integration? And so if it is possible to achieve binding over the network, which the basic intuition there is like, if they're getting binding across their brains, why can't we replace this with a radio? Because again, it's all just spikes, like this classical spikes coming down this fiber bundle. Then this implies that it should be possible to enable substrate independence, like design conscious machines that can replicate our phenomenal content to make available to your first person perspective. Or the step beyond that is to design totally novel phenomenal modes that you could couple into your moment. And you can see like, yes, that is the 11D space that I was thinking of. I could not have experienced it any other way. And that was actually useful. Or merge two into a product moment co-experience in the world, like this brain-to-brain connection. And so that would be potentially possible with a sufficient BCI. All right, that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ms. Hodak, for the perspective talk on consciousness. Okay, let's open the Q&A session. All questions are online participants, please chat on the Zoom text box. I will pick up and make you able to speak. And already here, if you are here, so please raise your hand. Okay, let's go around 15 minutes. Okay, go. It's you. Yours.
So my question, I just want to dive right into it, is about the independent subspaces of the disentangled representations. Just how independent can we find them out to be? I'm very interested in constructing these substrate independent minds as a form of testing that there are independent neural circuits that you can bundle together that will then produce a higher level mental function step by step. And this, you call this on manifold binding. And I just wonder, are there some circuits in the brain that you're aware of that could be causally closed that we could use for this kind of experiment, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, so this goes back to like one of those first assumptions where I see consciousness as really being independent from intelligence. And unless there's some type of downward causation happening that makes consciousness available to evolution, then the only thing that evolution can optimize is the intelligence. You can always see through behavior. And so my concern is that kind of conventionally, there's no measurement that you can take that will tell you what the phenomenal content is like. And the idea that you build this up, I mean, the content is directly related to the representations created by the brain. So there's a correlation there, but it's but seeing that the buildup of processing doesn't necessarily tell you about the nature of the internal experience. I mean, I think if you could prove that this theory was true, then you'd be able to say reason by analogy and say, okay, now I know how to design it. But I think that the tricky, so like I'm not saying that it's fundamentally impossible, but getting to the point where we had enough confidence to say, like we've validated the theory, now we can go out of distribution. I don't think we've done yet.
Yeah. And do you think maybe looking at some high resolution data sets like functional calcium imaging connectomes with electron microscopy data sets would maybe give us some of that out of distribution representations?
But I mean, again, the question, like here's another way to put it. I think that when we have the equations, so because ultimately the big prizes will be for equations, they will only describe a first person perspective. They won't make any statements about other conscious agents. I think like the problem with consciousness is not that it's magic. It's that the set of you're looking for a theory where the set of observables is empty. And so that's just very different than all of our other physical theories, but that doesn't mean that it's magic.
Thank you. I have two questions. So the first question maybe relevant to the previous one, but if the brain actually has I mean the such kind of good representation without in an unsupervised way, I'm not sure how the brain is doing that kind of doing that kind of learning in it.
So how is the brain doing the representation learning?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that is known about this. I'm not an expert in it, but the comment that I'll have is the way that the brain is different than like deep learning is the lack of a global observer. And so in the deep learning case, you run this thing end to end, you generate a gradient, you back propagate it. That depends on this independent observer. Whereas in the brain, it's all the local synaptic learning rules. And that is definitely highly studied, but I'm not an expert on it.
So you think that
but one comment on this, there are some interesting results where with some relatively weak constraints, like I think just non-negativity and minimization of energy, disentangling comes out of toy circuits very quickly.
Oh, really? Okay, so thank you. And the second thing is that if the brain is coding the world model, there needs to be a prior for the brain. What do you think that prior would be for our brain?
Well, but I mean, so one of the craziest results that I've seen in the last year is when there are some architectures of neural network that you can train to model to have like very low free energy and recreate like to kind of learn these rich structures very readily. But there's some cases, and this is I'm not an expert in this, but there's some cases where you've seen results where you just take the architecture and you initialize the weights and you then train nothing and it still does reasonably well. And so this gets back to the Platonic representation hypothesis, where there seems to be some like deep structure about the universe that these things are all grabbing onto. And that might be where the prior is coming from. So if you think about the possibility of downward causation, like if you can have a sense of like, that might be what emergence is. And that is like a totally speculative physics claim. But in lieu, I think if you're just looking at like classical emergence, there's, I mean, for also no doubt there's genetic priors in the brain. I mean, we're the product of billions of years of evolution. There are clearly genetic priors, but I think the results from the deep learning community is that you don't like need very much of that.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go.
You talked about the necessity of maintenance as being related to consciousness. Like you need to maintain, if you have a memory, then you're putting energy into it constantly to maintain it. So for something like, I don't know, a spinal reflex, which might not be related to consciousness, would you then predict like a spinal reflex does not require maintenance? And can you use that type of relationship to detect? Like,
so spinal reflexes are almost feed forward and they're super fast. And so, yeah, I mean, you'd predict that not, but I mean, I do predict islands. And so I can't rule out islands. So I think a question that I didn't address here is like what the moment that you experience feels very common sense to you. Like, it's like, this is like, it's my vision, it's my hearing, I control my hands, I can speak. But if there are islands, and like, why do you experience like this one and not others? And I don't have, I think, a really solid underlying grasp of that.
like one part would be the frequency, like it's like, oh, my user interface is operating at 30 hertz.
Yeah.
And you know, the spinal reflex is operating at like 1,000 or whatever it's doing, right? And so just I don't have access to that phenomenologically. But the other point you made was that you have some maintenance that's, you know, like the cat can be born with reflexes, a cat doesn't be conscious to do all these things. So could you identify within the, like maybe in the cortex, there's parts that don't require energy maintenance to maintain a memory? Is that, do you think that's important?
No, it always takes energy to maintain a memory. But the at least as far as I can tell. But I mean, I do think cats are conscious, but the so there's big loops in the brain, especially through the precuneus, that seem to be really important, that kind of seem very correlated to the moment that we experience. Now, to your question about like burning energy to stabilize it, like the point of that feedback system, sorry, I've gotten like 3 hours of sleep every day this week. Was it the question I answered?
Like, you know,
yeah.
Brain out make this so long.
Yeah, like decerebrate. Yeah, and so like again, it's like intelligence is separate from consciousness, and there are certainly lesions that will leave more probably intelligence than we think intact while breaking some other phenomenal stabilization. Yeah.
But the energy maintenance thing, it isn't as related. Like you would say that to maintain the memory of a reflex still requires memory.
Oh, okay. So I remember what I was going to say. So another thing that I've kind of talked to some friends about as developing these ideas is there's many ways to interpret this idea of feedback control. So like, even if you just look in the retina, which is as feed forward of a structure as you get in the brain, there's still like metabolic homeostasis. And that still imposes like representations onto the information. Like from when you go to the photoreceptors, the ganglion cells are a very compressed latent space, and there's no loops there. But the metabolic homeostasis itself is a feedback loop. And so that is a thing I don't know how to bridge exactly. But I think that the scales here are it's multi-scale.
We will pick up the online question. Milad, can you hear me? And could you speak on online? Are you able to?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just thinking about the comment about the energy input to maintain forms in feedback loops being sort of like equivalent to the binding problem. My question is, thinking of like any AI inference, you know, all the weights might have the invariance necessary to qualify for a lot of the mathematical constraints, but during inference, it's going to happen over multiple clock cycles that have totally different energy inputs, and they have a partial set of the problem. So would that mean that the bound qualia would not work out in that case?
Yeah, so I do predict that like the data centers are have phenomenal content. I do not know if that is valence loaded. I don't think though that it looks anything like ours. Like there probably is some phenomenal content associated with it, but it's probably totally alien and something that we would have a really hard time reasoning about one way or the other right now. And so I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me if kind of during inference and during training, there were islands of experience that were inaccessible to us. This is basically a metaphysical claim in lieu of better BCIs. But I would still in that case predict it to be like, it's not like when it's showing up like a human in language, it doesn't not have the internal structured experience of our modes.
Do you have a comment about specifically the clock cycle being a concern or not?
I don't know. Like, I think if you're looking for a fundamental theory like QM or QFT or GR, it applies at basically all space and length scales. And so I think you have to take that seriously. Now, if it's very, very fast, then the amount of information that can be stored in each moment, I mean, it depends on the substrate, but there'll be some things, some phenomena that you will only see as beats and never continuous signals. But just because it's fast doesn't necessarily bother me.
Okay, the next question from the Daniel. Could you speak it?
Yes, hello. Nice to meet you. And amazing talk. I was just wondering, like, if you've ever read about Professor Masataka Watanabe's work on split brain, or like the split brain BMI, to basically have a BMI that reads the input and output from the corpus callosum and then tries to mirror it onto an artificial hemisphere in order to have a test for machine consciousness and a way to do mind uploading. Because the last slide you presented sounded very familiar in terms of reasoning, and I was wondering if you've heard about it.
I don't know that I got the specific reference, but I mean, split brain patients are definitely a super interesting experimental setup. Actually, I was just talking to someone the other day that apparently has a patient with I think a brainstem stroke, and they've got a reversible callosal block prep that they can show the patient is unconscious in one hemisphere at a time. And so I think that type of stuff is going to be really rich for experiment.
Yes, awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Anyone on site? Okay.
Thank you for your interesting talk. And I'm a very biological side. I mean, like I'm a neuroscience, but focus mainly work on the development of the cortex and the thalamocortical connection. Anyway, I'm daily doing some kind of experiment using a mouse model or human like infant tissue, then doing some kind of thing. But my ideal. I want to tackle on the problem to understand what is the individual consciousness, the difference between a person and a person there. But as one of the biological sides, so what can we provide to this kind of field specialists?
Yeah, I mean,
to understand
I think it's you can always see through behavior. Now, with that said, I mean, it does strike me that we probably are living in much more different realities than we think every day. Like the idea that we have very similar experience. Like just imagine someone who has like a perfect eidetic memory and someone who has a very lossy memory, or someone who has like perfect attentional control and someone who has like very profound ADHD. Like the way that they experience and interact with the world is probably very different. And it wouldn't surprise me that like the time integrated effect of that experience produces like these are like the modes that are learned by the brain are approximate. It's not like mathematically precise, and they can go to different things. And so it wouldn't surprise me if our experience is actually more different than we think. But I think there's yeah, I mean, you can answer this just at the representational level with psychophysics, but knowing exactly how the qualia are different, I think would be really tough right now. At least without some strong assumptions.
Okay, thank you. The next is the online question. Okay, June, can you hear me? Please go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I've just can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to ask Max whether or not he was familiar with the work of Andres Gomez Emelson and the Qualia Research Institute, who I think he explores very similar ontologies. I think he would agree with you about a lot of things around physicalism, valence, qualia, and so on. He's got some different takes on the boundary problem you might find interesting, but the main thing he's been exploring lately is the idea of qualia as a sort of like an unyet discovered or unformalized gauge theory. It's sort of been a big part of his thinking lately. I was just curious whether or not you were familiar with his work.
Yeah, I know Andres.
Oh, cool.
So for some of the extensions of theory, I'm less sure of, but I think a thing that I appreciate from him is he is like one of the best phenomenologers that we know. Like the ability to like take something and then just go find like what are the symmetry groups that I find on the walls and like write them down in ways that you can actually recover something that is reflected into the brain. He is like
Mhm.
very good at that. And so I
Cool.
think that is going to be useful hints for sure.
Mhm.
Or things like
Oh,
correlating
that's-
tracers to like these oscillations and their impact on the structure of the modes. I think just characterizing all of that is very valuable work.
Yeah, that's awesome. I had one more thing I wanted to ask around consciousness frames is whether you are familiar with the relatively consistent, I've written about this on my blog a little bit, relatively consistent claims across meditators that things tend to sort of like follow like a 40 hertz consciousness frame, I guess like subjective refresh rate. And that number 40 hertz comes up all the time. I think I first heard about it in Daniel Ingram's book.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't remember off the top. That's like the delta oscillation, maybe, or
That's the
no,
gamma
yeah,
oscillation.
gamma oscillation. Yeah, no, exactly. And so, exactly. And so I think these are clearly implicated in binding. And so one of the reasons that I like, one of the reasons that I think that the feedback control, so that the intuition behind like feedback controllers as being this central object is because I think that this question of how do you draw the border around a representation or its physically realized version of that is this like very deep question. And I think that this gives you a very nice explanation that kind of rolls up a bunch of other stuff at the same time. But the oh man, I'm like behind a crack.
You're allowed.
So yes, I mean, that shows up here and that has impacts on things like flicker fusion and the yeah, I mean, I think that you can work this into that those observations in this. Oh, I remember the thing I was going to say. So the the feedback control theory looks like binding by synchrony because it produces kind of very similar observations. Like if you think that that there's information that's propagating through these loops, and it does this in these kind of in this definite ways, like you don't start a cycle until the old one is done, then that produces these waves. And that looks like binding by synchrony, but it doesn't require you to have some other like physical answer for like, is there a time constant or is there some other density function that produces binding? But it produces very similar observations.
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes sense. That was a good slide. Like that slide. Glad you brought that slide up.
Hi, I'm Haley. Nice to meeting you. And I like since you left the previous company Neuralink, what project you are aim for, like focusing on it these days?
At the new company?
Yeah.
So we have a couple projects. I mean, the one that is furthest along is our retinal prosthesis. So we've got both an optogenetic gene therapy and an electrical implant. We kind of set out to restore vision to patients that had gone blind due to losing the photoreceptors. The electrical stimulator finished a major clinical trial last summer. It's really cool. If you haven't seen videos, there's clips online of like blind patients reading books and playing crossword puzzles. So that was a huge, huge effect. And so we're hoping to have that on market next summer. And then long story short, kind of like use that to fund the crazy research projects, which so back when I was in college, I had this idea of a different type of neural interface where instead of placing wires into the brain, what if you load a device with living neurons and engraft this? Like, would those grow in and form new chemical synapses? And the answer is they do everywhere. And we're going to publish that at some point in the coming year. And that we call it a biohybrid neural interface. I think like the way that I understand that thing, which is like a really crazy technology, is have you seen James Cameron's Avatar movies? So like, you know, the ponytails that the aliens have. I think for us, we often like evolution is a much better engineer than humans are by and large. So the question is like, how would nature solve this problem if it wanted just a big digital cable into the brain? And I think the answer is like, it would grow a big 13th cranial nerve with a connector at the end. And so I think that something like that is possible. Operationalizing that is definitely a research project, but is one of the things I'm most excited about.
Is it Elon Musk looking better in person?
I haven't
I
seen
do.
Elon. I haven't seen Elon in a little while.
Okay.
Okay, let's finish. Thank you for a great question and discussion. Okay, to close this session, okay, we will invite the Kanai-san, and he is the CEO and founder of Allier and the host of the CC Tokyo. Okay, can you hear me, Kanai-san?
Yeah, I can hear you. Let's see. Hi. Yeah, Max. Thank you very much for such an inspiring talk. Yeah. Yeah. I saw part of your talk already yesterday, and I was really already stimulated. Yeah.
Oh, you're
Sorry,
muted.
yeah, you were in mute.
Thank you all for coming.
What
It's not
happened?
all the time that.
Now you're
yeah.
in mute.
I hope it was interesting.
Oh, so yeah. Okay, I'm back.
Yeah,
Right.
We might be about to build uploads, but teleconferencing, singularity is clearly right around the corner.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed Max's talk. So I met him at the event by Brain Mind last March, and of course, I knew of his new company, but I didn't expect to see him in person. But then but what was really surprising to me was that like he had such a deep thought on consciousness and qualia, and so then back then like I was already like discussing this symmetry related stuff with Masafumi and colleagues, but then he had exactly the same idea, so I was really surprised. So I felt that I was ahead of time, but he had the same
One man
idea,
scooped.
but
Happens.
but also I gave a talk on this in a conference I'm attending in Hokkaido right now, and but then there were a lot of questions how we make a distinction between conscious versus unconscious. So like if we simply just assume some sort of connection between symmetry and qualia, but we still have to say what kind of network or what part of the network generates conscious qualia as opposed to unconscious just sensory processing. And but Max's idea about this feedback and temporality already has some solutions to such a problem. And I'm also very excited about his future directions for developing the gauge field kind of integration of the theory. So yeah, I hope everyone got some sort of new inspiration, and I hope I know this is the first consciousness talk Max gave in public, so I think that was probably equally surprising to many of you in the audience. So yeah, but I'm really looking forward to future collaborations, and also like maybe people in the audience might be able to contribute. So I think the Spirit of Consciousness Club in Tokyo is about building a community to work on consciousness together. So I hope you all join us, and yeah, then make this field exciting, and and potentially completely change it. And one final comment is that I think what's really exciting is that Max is the CEO of one of the top neurotechnology companies in the world, and at the same time, he's like talking about qualia, and so I think that combination is like really exciting. So yeah, so I'm like completely like thrilled, and yeah, so I think I hope this event becomes the beginning of something great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's clearly a very hard problem, but I do not think it is an impossible problem, and we'd be eager to collaborate. We need all of collaborate to solve these things.
Okay. Yeah, thank you all. And for everyone online, the session will end here. And records will upload on the YouTube CC Tokyo's channel, and you can see it. And okay, the special thanks to Mr. Hodak for sharing his perspective talk, perspective vision, and Hamada-san, Kanai-san, he's their organizer, and Nemo-san, Deep Core, the AI focused incubator, and we all the volunteer, the Tomeoka-san, Matsuda-kun, Takeda-san, Nishimoto-san. Okay, let's finish today's session.